moral emotions, which, when, and why. So I exactly want to attack those questions today. First of all, we'll talk about which emotions are seen as moral emotions and why, and talk about the functions that these emotions have in motivation and behavior regulation. And then talk about whether there's a relationship between the different kinds of moral emotions, and ask how does the nature of the relationship affect the moral emotions. We have a puzzle about whether power position or status position affects the moral emotions, and we have some interesting data about that. And then a little bit about whether culture affects the moral emotions. So my starting point is this, that the emotions that we have, all of the emotions that we have evolved, actually. And you see the illustration on the slide, I hope. You can see that emotions are reflected quite clearly in people's faces. Now, this indicates to us that these evolved emotions are pretty much universal among humans, that they are expressed and perceived similarly across human individuals. In other words, all of us understand what we're seeing in other people's emotions in more or less the same way, and that different societies, people living in different societies, can also recognize these emotions. Now, there's a huge literature that talks about deviations from this general principle, which I don't think necessarily invalidate the general idea. There are always peculiarities and particularities, and there's no doubt that culture has very deep, profound influences on every aspect of our lives. But nevertheless, this does not invalidate the idea that there's an underlying universal set of abilities, tendencies, and characteristics. And Darwin put this out there. He was the first person to talk about the importance of emotional expression. But it was not quite 100 years later when Paul Ekman and his colleagues started looking for what they called basic emotions. And by this, he basically meant, what are the emotions that everybody can recognize across cultures that are very different from one another? And they found that there were 7 emotions that had very high consensus in terms of recognition across cultures. And these were anger, contempt, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Ekman also noted that people can, to a certain extent, disguise or change their expression of these emotions, as well as all the other emotions that are not so easily recognized, and suggested that there might be cultural rules about how much we display of which kind of emotion under which kind of circumstance. And in fact, I and my colleagues contributed Turkish data to a later study of this led by David Matsumoto. And so if you're interested in that aspect of things, you can look at the article that we put in Turkish Psychology Journal several years ago. But I'm not going to focus on expression today, except to make the point that these are pretty universal, probably inherited genetically, and to now talk about the functions that these emotions may have. There's a lot of research, a lot of research on emotions. Some of it does talk about functions. Some of the functions that are talked about are to monitor the environment. Our emotions tell us what to pay attention to, what's important. They help to motivate our behavior and to guide our behavior, give us feedback about the results of our responses and so forth. But this is for emotions in general. What are the specific functions of moral emotions? I think on a very general level, we can say that they are designed to promote harmony and cooperation among people in their interactions. And they can do that in a couple of ways. One of them is to motivate us to do good things. They motivate good behavior, but they can also function to prevent harm to social relations, to prevent social chaos from emerging. And there are at least a couple of motivations there. One is to compensate for bad behavior if we do something bad ourselves, for example, by apologizing, making up for the other person's loss or whatever. And the other is to motivate us to punish other people's bad behavior. And a lot of people on the more economic games side of research have had a lot of fun looking at this motivation to punish bad behavior. It seems to be quite universal and powerful. But we still haven't decided which emotions are moral. How do we know that an emotion is a moral emotion? And so I think we can start by defining it as emotions that signal moral disapproval, that tell us that we are blaming somebody else or ourselves for doing something wrong. Now, which emotions are these? Shame, guilt. In other words, when we do something wrong, we blame ourselves and we suffer self-punishment actually in the form of these very unpleasant emotions. These ideas are pretty separate in English. They're not so terribly separate in Turkish, I've discovered. It's very hard for me to get a clear response from my students in discussions, for example, about how suçluluk and utanç are distinguished from one another, but I'll make a suggestion a couple of slides down the way. So there are these self-blaming emotions, but there are also emotions we have that blame others, other blaming emotions. And these are anger, which we usually feel in reaction to not only frustration, but injustice, unfairness of some kind. We also feel it along with the other two, which are contempt, which is looking down on the person for what they've done, or disgust, which is a feeling of revulsion, iğrenme, tiksinme. There's something interesting about these moral emotions, which is that they constitute, at least the other blaming emotions, constitute the first three emotions, alphabetically listed, of course, in Ekman's list. Basic emotions are other blaming moral emotions. The three of them are. Now, why would this be? Why would other blaming moral emotions be so recognizable cross-culturally? Just the facial expressions of them. Well, probably because all of the basic emotions, all 7 of them, communicate messages to other people. So when we show anger or contempt or disgust, we're giving a negative or a threatening message to the person that we're blaming. So it's advantageous, socially speaking, advantageous for people to understand when we are feeling one of these other blaming emotions. It's a signal to stop doing what they're doing. Okay, but when does this happen? What does it mean to do something bad? When do we blame ourselves or others? And the argument I'm going to make here is that depending on which theoretical point of view you want to take, these are the ones I want to take. When a moral code or ethic is violated, or when the expectations of a relational model are violated, then we're going to feel one of these other blaming emotions, or ourselves if we're the ones who are the violators. Now, yesterday, if you listen to Melike's talk, she implied that, or stated actually, that morality is quite definable in terms of care and fairness, or harm and fairness, and that everything else is a social code. But the points of view that I'm going to talk about here are a bit different from that. And they're also different from the moral foundations they're related to, but different from the moral foundations theory that Onurcan Hoca talked about. What is the difference? Moral foundations is about the individual's moral code, okay? But what I'm going to be talking about here is the moral codes that are relevant because of the relationship or the type of social organization that the person is in, not the person's personality or choices, but rather I'm going to be talking about relationships. So in 1997, Schwader, who had been a long-time critic of the Kohlberg idea of moral development, finally came up with an alternative scheme. And his most basic argument is that the moral code is not singular. Now, most people think about morality as being a single set of rules, but Schwader says no. There are at least 3 different codes or ethics that characterize certain kinds of social organizations. Now, in fact, he says all of these exist in all societies, but the amount of emphasis that's given to one or the other one might be different from one society to another. He's an anthropologist, so he takes up that more cultural overview rather than looking at the individual. But what are these 3 ethics? First of all, the community ethic, the rights and responsibilities with regard to the group and authority, including loyalty, obedience and disobedience, protection, duty. I think we could sort of sum it up as duty. The second ethic is autonomy. It's about the person, the rights and responsibilities of the individual with regard to harm and fairness. And thirdly, what he calls the divinity ethic. This is frequently interwoven with religion, with the religious beliefs of a given group or society. But it doesn't have to be about religion, it can just be about anything that requires purity of some sort. So the responsibilities and requirements regarding purity, sanctity, defilement, you can see many examples of this if you just go onto Twitter for about 5 minutes. I can talk about that later on. Now, these three ethics can be matched with the other blaming emotions. It so happens in English, the first letter of each of their names matches the one that goes together. So we see that there's more likely going to be contempt in community violations, anger in autonomy violations, disgust in divinity violations. They would never have come up with that theory if they were working in Turkish, perhaps, since it would have been not so much based on the spelling. Now, there's a second theory that's a little more general than Schrader's theory. Schrader is trying to directly explain different modalities, you might say, of morality. Alan Fisk, several years earlier, had come up with a theory that he called relational models theory. In fact, he subtitled his book, Structures of Social Life. So he thinks he's found 4 models of the ways that people can carry on their social relations. The first one he calls communal sharing, in which you treat all members of the group, whatever the group is, whether it's your family or your team or your nation, as equivalent with respect to some given resource or obligation or threat or whatever. But it's communality. The second one is authority ranking. It's about hierarchical relationships where somebody is the leader, somebody else is the follower, somebody's the commander, somebody else is the one who obeys. Although he restricts his discussion of this to the hierarchical relationships that are perceived as legitimate, you're going to see a little later. I think that's a problem. The third way of being together is in what he calls equality matching. So that if you help somebody, they should help you, or somebody else should help you in the long run. If there are things to be distributed, they should be distributed equally. There are opportunities, they should be equally available to all. If there are punishments, everybody should get the same punishment. Young children in particular are very sensitive to equality matching, but so are the rest of us. We believe that we should have equal votes, for example, in society. Or we think that if a resource is scarce, we should wait our turn rather than jumping to the head of the line, or what. Many examples of this. And the fourth kind of relationship that he talks about is market pricing, which I don't especially like the name, but here it is in the literature. This focuses on proportionality, equity. So if you put more in, you should get more out, basically. And I think we can match up the relational models with the moral codes. In other words, Fisk's system and Schrader's system are translatable into one another. So when we're talking about communal sharing, probably the moral code that's irrelevant there is going to be divinity. If we're talking about authority ranking, the community ethic is going to be relevant. If we're talking about either equality matching or market pricing, the autonomy ethic is going to be relevant. Okay, so I started into this disquisition about these two theories to try to define what is a violation. What counts as a violation? Well, it depends on which relational model you're in, or which ethic is applicable to your situation. So in communal sharing or the divinity ethic, not meeting the needs of others in the communal group would be a violation. Breaking the group rules, violating the boundaries, violating the taboos, not keeping up your purity, in other words, is going to be a violation. Letting somebody in that doesn't belong, for example, or sharing something with somebody who's not part of the group might be a violation here. What about in a hierarchical situation that's governed by the community ethic? Well, disobeying, flouting authority and tradition, disloyalty. If you're in a superior position, failure to protect your the people you're supposed to protect, overstepping boundaries of rank, haddini bilmemek. These are all the violations in authority ranking. And in the equality matching, market pricing kinds of relationships that are governed by the autonomy ethic, behaving unfairly, not reciprocating. These are the kinds of cheating, you know. These are the kinds of things that count as violations. Now, as you can see, they're fairly substantial differences between the kinds of behaviors that count as violations, depending on the type of relational model or the ethic. So when there is a violation, somebody else violates something in one of these relationships. How are we going to react to it? We're going to react to it according to the cultural ethics and the relational models, not according to the behavior itself. In other words, even what makes it a violation is what kind of a relationship is it happening in. So these are our three other blaming emotions now. Anger. So it's typical of disapproval. Disapproval, maybe putting it mildly, if you look at our dramatic pictures here. Typical of disapproval in the autonomy moral code or in equality matching, market pricing, relational models. I put anger first here because it's not only typical of disapproval in autonomy or EMMP, relational models, it also is aroused in the other kinds of violations as well, but it's kind of displaced by the other blaming emotions. For example, disgust. We pretty much see disgust in the so-called divinity moral code, in other words, in communal sharing relational models. Now, in English vernacular, in quite recent years, people have begun to use the word disgust almost interchangeably with anger. I'm not sure whether that's true in Turkish. So you think to yourselves, you know, would you say kızıyorum ve iğreniyorum to mean the same thing? I'm not sure about that. And the third one that we talked about is contempt, which is typical of disapproval now in the community and community moral code or the authority ranking model I put in these pictures to show you that, in fact, there are very typical facial expressions that are associated with these things. We can read these immediately. What about self-blaming emotions? They're harder to detect in the face. It's not impossible, but it's harder. Pardon. But whether you're going to feel shame or whether you're going to feel guilt may also depend on which relational model we're talking about. So how do you blame yourself in a communal sharing violation? Well, you'd be anxious about being rejected, about being excluded, feeling unworthy. And that adds up to shame, basically. Whereas in a hierarchical relationship, community violation, you're probably more likely to be worried about not losing closeness, but losing reputation, losing status. So there's a slightly different version of shame there. And in the EMMP autonomy violations, you're more likely to be conscious of doing some particular act that harms somebody else or other people. And so the desire to make up for that, regret, goes together with the emotion of guilt. Now I'm showing you both shame and guilt, and we see that in both cases, the best pictures I could find were ones in which people covered their faces. So I'm not sure that they're entirely different, but if you look at the opposite, the antonym for these words, we get a better sense of how they're different from one another. So the opposite of shame is pride, and the opposite of guilt is innocence. So they are closely related. We often feel both of them at the same time. But if there's an emphasis, it's probably in terms of whether we are losing our pride or losing our innocence. So my hypothesis is going to be that there's a relationship between the self and the other blaming emotions. So if you think about it, when there's a moral violation, there's a perpetrator and there's a victim. The victim, obviously, is going to feel an other blaming emotion. Because that bad guy is doing something bad to me. The perpetrator should feel a self-blaming emotion. So the question is, do these two go together? Can we predict one from the other? Or here, I've divided shame into those two different ways. Anger and guilt should go together. Disgust and shame should go together. Contempt and shame should go together. So is there any way to test these? Well, these hypotheses are the ones that are listed on the slide here. Number one, the reciprocal, these are reciprocal pairs, I'm saying, or complementary. The reciprocal or complementary pairs of emotions, the self-blaming plus the other blaming, will vary according to the relational model. So we would expect to see that disgust and shame will be more closely correlated in the communal sharing model that's about divinity or purity, whereas anger and guilt should be more closely associated in equality matching and market pricing models, that is the autonomy ethic, and contempt and shame will be more closely correlated in the authority ranking model or the community ethic. And we would predict that the patterns should be similar across cultures. In other words, if our emotions are evolved, if they have certain more or less standard functions, then these functions will be similar across cultures when you're looking at the same relational model or moral ethic. So we carried out 3 studies to try to test these things or to build up some sort of knowledge base about them. And the result was published earlier this year. You can see the reference at the bottom of the slide. The first study was simply trying to establish that people who observe moral violations are going to feel other blaming emotions differently in the different relational models. And for all of these, by the way, we used vignettes that are illustrating the different kinds of violations in the relational models. We use situations that would exemplify the relational models. In the second study, the aim was to expand this understanding by getting people to try to predict what the victim would feel, what kinds of other blaming emotions the victim would feel, and the self-blaming emotions that the perpetrator might feel in any given violation. And those are, again, sorted out by the relational models. And then the third study was an attempt to see whether across cultures we get a similar pattern. So let's look at these 3 studies in slightly more detail. In the first one, which, as I said, was just an attempt to see whether there were differences across the relational models, what we saw is that whenever moral wrongness was rated high, the intensity of the other blaming emotions were highly correlated. That is, those were also high. And then if you just compared the strength of the 3 other blaming emotions, anger was the strongest, followed by disgust, followed by contempt. But more to the point, we found that the different relational models had different patterns of emotion. So, for example, communal sharing, relationships, when there was a violation there was a greater likelihood of strong disgust, or in equality matching, greater a spike in anger, those kinds of things. What we didn't expect, and we did find, is that it made a big difference whether we're talking about violations by a dominant or a subordinate partner in a hierarchical relationship. So this sort of messed up our theory from the very beginning. And we really need to continue to work on that. Okay, in the second study, as I said, the aim was to look at the links between the complementary emotions. In the first study, we weren't able to see that. And our hypotheses were specifically that the link between victim disgust and perpetrator shame will be stronger in CS relations than the other relational models, that the contempt perpetrator shame link will be stronger in authority ranking than in the other relational models, and that the victim anger and perpetrator guilt link will be stronger in EM and MP relations than the other relational models. So what did we find? We did find that victim disgust and perpetrator shame was stronger in communal sharing than in the other relational models. This was our strongest support for our hypotheses. But just as in study one, the emotions in authority ranking didn't follow predictions. In equality matching, the link between victim anger and perpetrator guilt was stronger than the other links in equality matching, but it wasn't stronger than the link between anger and guilt in CS, okay, in communal sharing. So that's sort of partial support for that. We found that shame was a bit stronger than guilt. I'll show you now you can see it really hugely makes a difference which relational model you're talking about as to how much guilt or shame the perpetrator feels. And it's pretty similar between CS and EM. It's much less when you're in a dominant position or when you're in the market pricing relationship. So those are interesting kinds of findings. And you can see here that the disgust shame link is quite a bit higher in CS, and that the EM and anger guilt connection is higher than the similar connections across EM. And we did exactly the same thing in study 3, except we changed the design from a within participants design, where people were looking at all of the different kinds of violations, to a between participants design, where each person only saw one kind of violation. But interestingly enough, we got exactly the same patterns. There were some differences in detail between the cultures, but not much. So it was so close that I think we can say that our idea that the patterns are the same across cultures holds up. Now here, once again, you can see that anger is more prevalent than the other two emotions. That disgust is much higher in CS than it is in the other relational models, and that contempt varies so much that it's hard to say that it's related particularly to AR relationships. So what can we conclude from these studies? Well, number one, clearly relational models do influence the moral emotions. Secondly, the other blaming and the self-blaming emotions are related under some conditions, I should say, in some relational models, particularly in CS, where you get the much stronger relationship between disgust and shame, and to some extent in equality matching, where anger and guilt seem to go together more than in other other pairs for equality matching. And I think we can conclude that the patterns of moral emotions are similar across the two different cultures. Those two cultures, let me remind you, are Turkish-speaking students and English-speaking students in both England and the United States. But there were no differences between England and the United States. and very little difference between the English speakers and the Turkish speakers, except there was a bit more anger in the Turkish speakers, and there was a little bit more contempt in the English speakers. But in terms of the emotions relationship to relational models, there was no difference between the two cultures. But what we do take out of this only partial support for the theory is that we really need to study the effects of hierarchy or power in more detail, because you get really opposite effects. When the perpetrator is the dominant person, there's very little moral emotion on either side. In other words, the person who is harmed doesn't seem to blame the powerful person very much, and the powerful person shows almost no guilt or shame. But when the perpetrator is subordinate, there are very strong emotions on both sides. There's a great deal of anger from the dominant person who has been harmed, and very strong guilt and shame, both in the person who has caused the harm. Now, when we look at market pricing, the results are again mixed, and we think that that's probably because there is hierarchy involved in market pricing. So our results sometimes look more like the equality matching, sometimes look more like the authority ranking. There are aspects of both, because market pricing is a kind of fairness rule, but it can result, applying it can result in hierarchy. So how that affects emotions needs to be studied in considerably more detail. So that's what I plan to say. Be nice now to have a discussion.